Why is Blackbeard holding prisoners for ransom off the coast of Charlestown? Ralph D. Paine, today on the Classic Tales podcast. Welcome to the Classic Tales podcast. Thank you for listening. The Audiobook Library Card is the perfect solution if you can't get enough classic audiobooks. Unlimited downloads and streaming of the entire Classic Tales library for $9.99 a month. Use the coupon code ClassicTales2 and save $3 on your first month. You can also subscribe yearly at the lower price if you like. Go to audiobooklibrarycard.com or follow the link in the show notes. The Audiobook Library Card is an all-you-can-listen smorgasbord of classics I've been building for the last 18 years. Many have won awards. Only about a quarter of the library has been on the podcast. And with the Audiobook Library Card, you gain access to everything. So head on over to audiobooklibrarycard.com and start listening. In today's episode, you can really tell that Paine was a journalist. The sea battles are very well researched and described with precision. Combining his research chops with a brisk narrative style really delivers a great story. I hope you like it. And now, Blackbeard Buccaneer, Part 2 of 8 by Ralph D. Paine. Chapter 3. Held as Hostages to Blackbeard. To discover the pestilent Blackbeard in Carolina waters was like a thunderbolt from a clear sky. Captain Welsby had felt confident that he could beat off the ordinary pirate craft, which is apt to be smaller than his own stout ship. And most of these unsavory gentry were mere saltwater burglars who had little taste for hard fighting. The master of the Plymouth Adventure, so pious and sedate, was a brave man to whom the thought of surrender was intolerable. From what he knew of Blackbeard, it was useless to try to parley for the lives of his passengers. Better it was to answer with double-shotted guns than to beg for mercy. The British tars, stripped to the waist, turned anxious eyes to the skipper upon the quarterdeck, while they quaffed pannikins of rum and water, and cracked many a rough jest. They fancied death no more than other men, but seafaring was a perilous trade, and they were toughened to its hazards. They were facing hopeless odds, but let the master shout the command, and they would send the souls of some of these pirates sizzling down to hell before the Plymouth Adventure sank, a splintered hulk in the smoke of her own gunpowder. Captain Welsby delayed his decision a moment longer. Something most unusual had attracted his attention. A ball of smoke puffed from a port of Blackbeard's ship, but the round shot splashed beyond the bowsprit of the Plymouth Adventure, instead of thudding into her oaken side. This was a signal to heave to. It was a courtesy, both unexpected and perplexing, because Blackbeard's habit was to let fly with all the guns that could bear as the summons to submit. Presently a dingy bit of cloth fluttered just beneath the black flag. It looked like the remains of a pirate's shirt which had once been white. "A signal for a truce?" muttered Captain Welsby. "A ruse, mayhap, but the rogue has no need to resort to trickery." The two sloops of Blackbeard's squadron, spreading tall, square topsails, came driving down to windward, in readiness to fire their bow-chasers and form in line of battle. The passengers of the Plymouth Adventure, snatching at the chance of safety, implored the skipper to send his men away from the guns, lest a rash shot might be their ruin. They prayed him to respect the precious flag of truce, and to ascertain the meaning of it. Mystified and wavering in his purpose, he told the mates to back the main yard and heave the ship to. Upon his own deck, Blackbeard was stamping to and fro, bellowing at his crew, while he flourished a broadsword by way of emphasis. The hapless company of the Plymouth Adventure shivered at the very sight of him, and yet there was something almost ludicrous in the antics of this atrocious pirate, as though he were play-acting upon the stage of a theater. He had tucked up the tails of his military coat because the wind whipped them around his bandy legs and made him stumble. The flowing whiskers also proved bothersome, wherefore he looped them back over his ears by means of the bows of crimson ribbon. This seemed to be his personal fashion of clearing for action. "There be pirates and pirates," critically observed Mr. Peter Forbes, as he stared at the unpleasant Blackbeard. "This is a filthy beast, Jack, and he was badly brought up. He has no manners whatever." "Pastor Throckmorton would take him for the devil himself," gloomily answered the lad. And now they saw Blackbeard raise the speaking trumpet to his lips, and heard the hoarse voice come down the wind with this message. "The ship ahoy! Steady as ye be, blast your eyes, or I'll lay aboard and butcher all hands." He turned and yelled commands to the two sloops which now rolled within pistol shot. In helter-skelter style, but with great speed, one boat after another was lowered away and filled with armed pirates. They rowed toward the Plymouth Adventure, and there were enough of them to carry her by boarding. In addition to this, she was directly under the guns of Blackbeard's powerful ship. One valorous young gentleman passenger whipped out a rapier and swore to perish with his face to the foe, but Captain Welsby kicked him into the cabin and fastened the scuttle. This was no time for dramatics. "It looks that the old ruffian comes on a peaceful errand," said the skipper, by way of comfort. But the hysterical ladies below decks redoubled their screams, and one substantial merchant of Charlestown scrambled down to hide himself among them. Mr. Peter Arbuthnot Forbes folded his arms, and there was no sign of weakness in his pink countenance. His dignity still sustained him. As agile as monkeys, the mob of pirates poured over the bulwark, slashing through the hammock nettings, and swept forward in a compact mass, driving Captain Welsby's seamen before them and penning them in the forecastle. Having cleared the waist of the ship, they loitered there until a few of them discovered the galley and pantry. They swept the shelves and lockers bare of food like a pack of famished wolves. Jack Cockrell looked at them from the poop and perceived they were a gaunt, ragged lot. The skins of some were yellow like parchment, and fits of trembling overtook them. Something more than dissipation ailed them. With a bodyguard of the sturdiest men, Blackbeard clambered up the poop ladder, and, with wicked oaths, told the skipper to stand forth. Clean and trig and carefully dressed, Captain Jonathan Welsby confronted these savage, unwashed pirates, and calmly demanded to know their errand. It was plain to read that Blackbeard thought himself an imposing figure. With a smirk and a grimace, he bowed clumsily to a woman on deck who had refused to desert her husband. He growled like a bear at Captain Welsby, and prodded the poor man with his cutlass, as he thundered, "You tried my patience, shipmaster, with your cracking on sail. A little more, and I'd have slit your throat. Blood and wounds, would you dare to vex Blackbeard?" Captain Welsby faced him with unshaken composure, and returned in a strong voice, "I beg no favours for myself, but these helpless people, women amongst them, came on board with my assurance of safety. They have friends and kinsmen in Charlestown, who will ransom them in gold." Blackbeard's mien was a shade less ferocious, as he cried, "Gold! Can it cool a fever, or heal a festering sore? A score of my men are down, and the others are tottering ghosts. Medicines I must have. A foul plague on those ports of the Spanish Main, which laid my fine lads by the heels." Jack Cockrell, who had retreated to the taffrail, decided that this unkempt pirate was not so absurd as he appeared. There was the strength of a giant in those hulking shoulders, and in the long arms which bulged the coat sleeves, and the man moved with a quickness which made that clumsy air deceptive. The beard masked his features, but the eye was keen and roving, and he had a trick of baring his teeth in a nasty snarl. He uttered no more threats, however, and seemed to be anxiously awaiting the reply of Captain Welsby, who said, "The few medicines and simples in my chest will not suffice your need. Your ships are rotten with the Spanish fever." "A ransom, shipmaster," exclaimed the pirate. "'Twas in my mind when I flew a white flag for parley. I will hold some of your fine passengers as hostages, while the others go into Rake Charlestown for medicines to fetch back to my fleet." "You will send my ship in?" asked the skipper. "No.
This Plymouth Adventure is my good prize, and I will overhaul the cargo and sink her at my leisure. My ship will tack into Charlestown Bar. Then let the messengers go in the longboat to find the store of medicines. Harkee, shipmaster. 2 days, no longer, for their return. Failing this, the hostages feed the fishes. Such sport had livened the hearts of my doleful seamen.
It was a shameful bargain, thus to submit to a pirate's whim, but the wretched ship's company hailed it as a glad surprise. They had stood in the shadow of death, and this was a respite and a chance of salvation. Captain Welsby was heartsick with humiliation, but it was not for him to take into his hands the fate of all these others. Sadly, he nodded assent. Jack Cockrell nudged his uncle and whispered, "Why doesn't he sail in with his 3 ships and take what he likes? The town lies helpless against such a force as this."
"Shh! Be silent," was the warning. "He is a wary bird of prey, and he fears a trap. He dare not attack the port, since he lacks knowledge of its defences."
Jack's cheek was rosy again, and his knees had ceased to tremble. There was no immediate prospect of walking the plank. To be captured by Blackbeard was a finer adventure than strutting arm in arm with Captain Stede Bonnet. It was mournful, indeed, that Captain Welsby should have to lose his ship, but 'tis an ill wind that blows nobody good, and the voyage to England, which Jack had loathed from the bottom of his heart, was indefinitely postponed. Such an experience as this was apt to discourage Uncle Peter Forbes from trying it again. There were sundry chicken-hearted passengers anxious to curry favor with Blackbeard, who gabbled when they should have held their tongues, and in this manner he learned that he had bagged the Honorable Secretary of the Provincial Council. The bewhiskered pirate slapped his thighs and roared with glee.
"Damn me, but he looks it. Alack that my sorry need of medicines compels me to give quarter. Would I might swing this fat secretary from the topsail yard! And a rogue of a lawyer to boot, he tempts me."
"I demand the courtesy due a hostage,"
exclaimed Mr. Peter Forbes.
"Ho, ho, ho! He shall be my lackey, the chief messenger,"
laughed Blackbeard, showing his yellow teeth.
"Hat in hand, begging medicines for me."
The Honorable Secretary was near apoplexy. He could only sputter and cough. He was to be sent as an errand boy to the people of Charlestown at the brutal behest of this unspeakable knave. But refusal meant death, and there were his fellow captives to consider. He thought of his nephew, and was about to plead that Jack be sent along with him, when Blackbeard demanded,
"What of the boy? He takes my eye. No pursy swine of a lawyer could sire a lad of his brawn and inches."
"I am Master Cockrell," Jack answered for himself, "and I would have you more courteous to my worthy uncle." It was a speech so bold that the scourge of the Spanish Main tugged at his whiskers with an air of comical perplexity. The headstrong Jack was keen enough to note that he had made an impression, and he rashly added, "'Tis not long since I knocked a pirate on the head for incivility." Mr. Peter Forbes gazed aghast, with slackened jaw, expecting to see his mad nephew cut down by the sweep of a broadsword. But Blackbeard merely grinned, and slapped the lad halfway across the deck with a buffet of his open hand. Dizzily, Jack picked himself up and was furiously scolded by his uncle. Their lives hung by a hair, and this was no time to play the fool. For once, however, Jack was the wiser of the two. In an amiable humor, Blackbeard exclaimed,
"And so this strapping young jackanapes knocks pirates on the head. There be lazy dogs among my men that well deserve it. You shall stay aboard, Master Cockrell, whilst the juicy lubber of a lawyer voyages into Charlestown. He may sweat and strive the more if I hold you as his security. Zounds, I'll make a gentleman rover of you, Jack, for I like your mettle."
It was futile for the unhappy uncle to argue the matter. He could only obey the tyrant's pleasure and hope for a speedy return and the release of the terrified passengers. The Plymouth Adventure was ordered to haul her course to the westward and jog under easy sail toward the Charlestown bar. Blackbeard was rowed off to his own ship, the Revenge, leaving his sailing master and a prize crew. These amused themselves by dragging the weeping women on deck and robbing them of their jewels and money, but no worse violence was offered. Middle-aged matrons and elderly spinsters, they were neither young nor fair enough to be stolen as pirates' brides. The Revenge and the two sloops hovered within sight of the Plymouth Adventure, and their sails gleamed phantom-like in the darkness. There was little sleep aboard the captured merchant trader. Some of the pirates amused themselves with hauling chests and boxes out of the cabins and spilling the contents about the deck in riotous disorder. One sprightly outlaw arrayed himself in a silken petticoat and flowered bodice, and paraded as a languishing lady with false curls, until the others pelted him with broken bottles and tar buckets. By the flare of torches they ransacked the ship for provisions, cordage, canvas, and heaped them ready to be dumped into boats. Jack Cockrell looked on until he was too drowsy to stay awake, and fell asleep on deck, his head pillowed on his arm. Through the night the watches were changed to the harsh summons of the pirate sailing master or his mate. Once Jack awoke when a seaman staggered into the moonlight with blood running down his face. He was not likely to be caught napping on watch again. At dawn, the Plymouth Adventure was astir, and the Revenge ran close aboard to watch Mr. Peter Arbuthnot Forbes and two prosperous merchants of Charlestown bundled into the longboat. Blackbeard shouted bloody threats through his trumpet, reminding them that he would allow no more than 2 days' grace for their errand ashore. Uncle Peter was deeply affected as he embraced his nephew and kissed him on the cheek. Jack's eyes were wet, and he faltered with unsteady voice, "Forgive me, sir, for all the trouble I have made you. Never did I expect a parting like this."
"A barbarous coast, Jack, and a hard road to old England," smiled the Secretary of the Council. "Have a stout heart. By God's grace I shall soon deliver you from these sea vermin."
The boy watched the longboat hoist sail with a grizzled, scarred old boatswain from the Revenge at the tiller. It drove for the blue fairway of the channel between the frothing shoals of the bar and made brave headway for the harbor. Then the ship stood out to sea to go clear of a lee shore, and the captives of the Plymouth Adventure endured the harrowing suspense with such courage as they could muster. Should any accident delay the return of the longboat beyond 2 days, even headwinds or foul weather, or if there was a lack of medicines in the town, they were doomed to perish. Jack Cockrell endured it with less anguish than the other wretched hostages. He had the sublime confidence of youth in its own destiny, and he had found a chum in a boyish pirate named Joseph Hawkridge, who said he had sailed out of London as an apprentice seaman in a ketch bound to Jamaica. He had been taken out of his ship by Blackbeard, somewhere off the Azores, and compelled to enlist or walk the plank. At first he was made cook scullion, but because he was well-grown and active, the chief gunner had taken him over as a powder boy. This Joe Hawkridge was a waif of the London slums, hard and wise beyond his years, who had been starved and abused ever since he could remember. He had fled from cruel taskmasters ashore to endure the slavery of the sea, and to be kidnapped into piracy was no worse than other things he had suffered. A gangling lad, with a grin on his homely face, he had certain instincts of manliness, of decent conduct, although he had known only men whose souls were black with sin. Heaven knows where he learned these cleaner aspirations. They were like the reflection of a star in a muddy pool. It was easy for Jack Cockrell to win his confidence. Few of his shipmates spoke kindly or showed pity for him, and their youth drew them together. Jack's motive was largely curiosity, as soon as he discovered that there was one of Blackbeard's crew ready to confide in him. The two lads chatted in sheltered corners of the deck, between watches, or met more freely in the night hours. Jack shuddered at some of the tales that were told him, but he hearkened breathless and asked for more.
"Yes, this Blackbeard is the very wickedest pirate that ever sailed,"
said Joe Hawkridge in the most matter-of-fact tones.
You have found him merciful because he fears a mortal sickness will sweep through his ships."
"You have curdled my blood enough for now," admitted Jack. "Tell me this. What do they say of Captain Stede Bonnet? He chances to be a friend of mine." Joe Hawkridge ceased to grin. He was startled and impressed. Real gentlemen like this young cockerel always told the truth. Making certain that they could not be overheard, Joe whispered,
"What news of Stede Bonnet? You seen him? When? Did he cruise to the north'ard? Has he been seen off Charlestown?"
"He came ashore not long ago, and invited me to dinner at the tavern with him," bragged Jack. "And he coaxed me to sign in his ship."
"Yes, you catch his eye, cockerel. But listen, what ship had he, and how many men? God strike me, but I'll not tattle it. I'm true as steel to Stede Bonnet. If you love me, don't breathe it here."
"There is no love lost betwixt him and Blackbeard?" excitedly queried Jack.
"Mortal foes they be, if you ask Stede Bonnet."
Feeling sure he could trust this young Hawkridge, Jack informed him, "Stede Bonnet flies his pennant in a fine brig, the Royal James, with 70 lusty rovers. But what about him, Joe? Why does he hate this foul ogre of a Blackbeard? Did they ever sail together?"
"'Twas in the Bay of Honduras. Captain Bonnet was a green hand at the trade, but zealous to win renown at pirating, and so he made compact with Blackbeard to sail as partners. There was Stede Bonnet with a fine ship and his own picked crew. By treachery, Blackbeard stole the vessel from him. Bonnet and his men were left to shift for themselves in a rotten old hulk that was made to founder in the breeze of wind."
"But they stayed afloat and took them a good ship," proudly exclaimed Jack, with a personal interest in the venture.
"True, by what you say. Do you see the Revenge yonder, Blackbeard's tall cruiser? The very ship he filched from Stede Bonnet by dirty stratagem and broken oaths."
"Then the powder will burn when next they meet."
"As long as there's a shot in the locker, Jack, and Blackbeard's men are ripe for mutiny. Let 'em once sight Stede Bonnet's topsails and—"
A gunner's mate broke into this interview with a cat-o'-nine-tails and flogged Joe Hawkridge forward to duty. He ducked and fled with a farewell grin at the nephew of the Secretary of the Council. Now all this was diverting enough to keep Jack from bemoaning his fate. But the other passengers counted the hours one by one, and their hearts began to drum against their ribs. They scanned the sea and the harbor bar with aching eyes, for the 2 days were well-nigh spent, and there was never a sign of the longboat and the messengers with the ransom of medicines which should avert the sentence of death. Sunrise of the second day brought them no comfort. The sea was gray and the sky leaden, without the slightest stir of wind. The drifting vessels rolled in a swell that heaved as smooth as oil. It was a calm which presaged violent weather. Against her masts, the yards of the Plymouth Adventure banged with a sound like distant thunder, and the idle canvas slatted to the thump of blocks and the thin wail of chafing cordage. Captain Jonathan Welsby was permitted the freedom of the poop by Blackbeard's sailing master, who seemed a sober and competent officer. They were seen to confer earnestly, as though the safety of the ship were uppermost in their minds. Soon the pirates of the prize crew were ordered to stow and secure all light sail, and pass extra lashings about the boats and batten the hatches. They worked slowly, some of them shaking with fever, nor could kicks and curses and the sting of the whistling cat make them turn too smartly. The sailing master signaled the Revenge to send off more hands, but Blackbeard was either drunk or in one of his crack-brained moods. With a laugh, he pulled a brace of pistols from his sash and blazed away at the Plymouth Adventure. The 2 sloops of the pirate squadron had sagged down to leeward during the night and were trying to work back to their stations when the dead calm intervened. Their skippers had sense enough to read the weather signs and had begun to take in canvas. On board of the Revenge, however, there was aimless confusion, the mates making some attempt to prepare the ship for a heavy blow, while Blackbeard defied the elements. His idea of arousing his men was to try pot-shots with his pistols as they crept out on the swaying spars. It was quite apparent that the sailing master was sorely needed in the Revenge, if order was to be brought out of this chaos. But he received no orders to quit the Plymouth Adventure. He was a proper seaman, Ned Rackham by name, who had deserted from the Royal Navy after being flogged and keel-hauled for some trifling offence. Rumour had it that he was able to enforce respect from Blackbeard, and would stand none of his infernal nonsense.
"In this autumn season we may catch a storm from the West Indies, Mr. Rackham," said Captain Welsby. "The sea has a greasy look, and this heavy groundswell is a portent." "The feel of it is in the air, shipmaster. There fell an evil calm like this one 2 years ago, when I was wrecked in a ship of the line within sight of Havana. 400 men sank with her."
"If my sailors were not penned in the forecastle," suggested the merchant skipper.
"None of that," was the stern retort. "This ship is a prize to Blackbeard, and so she stays, and you will sink or swim with her."
The morning wore on, and the 2 days of grace had passed for those doleful hostages in the Plymouth Adventure. They beheld the black flag hoisted to the rigging of the Revenge as a signal of tragic import. But the bandy-legged monster with the festooned whiskers was not to disport himself with this wanton butchery. The sky had closed darkly around the becalmed ships, in sodden clouds, which were suddenly obscured by mist and rain, while the wind sighed in fitful gusts. It steadied in the southward, and swiftly increased in force until the sea was whipped into foam and scud. Staunch and well found, the Plymouth Adventure went reeling off across the spray-swept leagues of water, showing only her reefed topsails and courses. The 2 pirate sloops vanished beyond the curtain of mist. When last seen, one of them was dismasted, and the other was labouring in grave peril. The Revenge loomed as a spectral shape, while Blackbeard was endeavouring to get her running free in pursuit of the Plymouth Adventure. But slovenly, reckless seamanship had caught him unready. His sails were blowing to ribbons, ropes flying at loose ends, and it was with great difficulty that the vessel could be made to mind her tiller. Already, the sea was rising in crested combers which broke with the noise of thunder, and the fury of the wind was insensate. Slowly the struggling Revenge dropped astern, yawing wildly, rolling her bulwarks under, splintered spars dangling from the caps. She was a crippled ship, which would be lucky to see port again. It was to be inferred that Blackbeard had ceased to cut his mirthful capers on the poop, and that he would have given bushels of doubloons to regain his sailing master and men. In the Plymouth Adventure, things were in far better plight, even with the feeble, short-handed prize crew. Prudently snugged down in ample time, with extra hands at the steering tackles, they let her drive. She would perhaps wear clear of the coast, and there was hope of survival, unless the tempest should fairly wrench her strong timbers asunder. Lashed to the weather rigging, Captain Jonathan Welsby wiped the brine from his eyes and waved his arm at the helmsman, now to ease her a little, again to haul up, and thus thwart some ravening sea, which threatened to stamp his ship under. Sailing Master Ned Rackham was content to let the skipper con his own vessel in this great emergency. The mind of Captain Welsby was very active, and he pondered on something else than winning through the storm. He had been helpless while under the guns of the Revenge, with the 2 sloops in easy call. Now the situation was vastly different. He had been delivered out of Blackbeard's clutches, and in the forecastle were 30 British seamen with hearts of oak, raging to be loosed with weapons in their hands. Peering into the grey smother of sea and sky, Captain Jonathan Welsby licked his lips hungrily, as he said to himself, "Not now. But if the storm abates and we float through the night, these lousy picaroons shall dance to another tune." Chapter 4. The Captive Seaman in the Forecastle. Jack Cockerell was seasick. This was enough to spoil any adventure. Curled up under a boat, the spray pelted him and the wild motion of the ship sloshed him back and forth. He took no interest even in piracy. Joe Hawkridge, tough as a whipcord and seasoned to all kinds of weather, came clawing his way aft while the water streamed from his thin shirt and ragged breeches. The pirates of the prize crew had sought shelter wherever they could find it. The waist of the ship was flooded with breaking seas. A few of the larboard watch were huddled forward, close to the lofty forecastle, where they were stationed as sentries over the imprisoned sailors of the Plymouth Adventure. The commotion of the wind shrieking in the rigging and the horrid crash of the toppling combers were enough to convince a landlubber that the vessel was doomed to founder. But Joe Hawkridge clapped young Jack an affectionate clout on the ear and bawled at him, "For his work he's never loath, and a pleasuring he'll go, though certain sure to be popped off. Yo-ho with the rum below." Jack managed to fetch a sickly smile of greeting, but had nothing to say. Joe snuggled down beside him and explained, "I wouldn't dare sing that song if Blackbeard's bullies could hear me. 'Tis known as Steed's Bonnet's ditty, for a fight or a frolic." "By Harry, they can roll it out. My blood tingled when they chorused it through Charlestown," said Jack, with signs of animation and a sparkle in his eye. "Tell me truly, Joe, what about this pirate sailing master, Ned Rackham? He seems a different sort from your other drunken wretches. He is more like one of Captain Bonnet's choosing." "Gulled you, has he?" cried Joe. "I was afeard of that, and he's getting on the blind side of your skipper. This Captain Jonathan Welsby is brave enough and a rare seaman, but he now dealt with a smooth rogue like Ned Rackham. He stays sober to plot for his own advantage. He will serve Blackbeard only till he can trip him by the heels. Now listen well, Jack, seasick though you be. You will have to warn your skipper, Captain Welsby." "Warn him of what? My poor head is so addled that I can fathom no plots. How can Ned Rackham do us mischief while this infernal gale blows? He toils with might and main for the safety of the ship." "Yes, you dunce, and let a lull come," scornfully exchanged the boyish pirate. "What then? A fine ship this, and well gunned. She would make a smacking cruiser for Ned Rackham, eh? He hoists the Jolly Roger on his own account and laughs at Blackbeard." "Take our ship for his own?" faltered Jack, his wits confused. "I never thought of that. Why, that means getting rid of us, of the passengers and crew." Joe passed a hand across his throat with a grimace that said more than words. "He has the ship's company disarmed and helpless, Jack, and pirates aplenty to work her till he recruits a stronger force. All hands of 'em have a surfeit of Blackbeard's bloody whims and didos." "And Captain Welsby will be caught off his guard," said Jack, shivering at the aspect of this new terror. "Can he do aught to prevent, unless he is bold enough to forestall it?" answered the shrewd young sea waif. "Better die fighting than be slain like squealing rats." "Recapture the ship ere Ned Rackham casts the dice," said Jack. "But it means playing the hazard in the midst of this storm. Can it be done? A forlorn venture. It can but fail." "You're as good as dead if you don't," was Joe's sensible verdict. Jack Cockrell forgot his wretched qualms of mind and body. The trumpet call of duty invigorated him. He was no longer a useless lump. The color returned to his cheek as he crawled from under the boat and shakily hauled himself to his feet. Joe Hawkridge nodded approval and exhorted, "Stiff upper lip, my gallant young gentleman. Steady she goes, and not too hasty. Ned Rackham is as sharp as a whetted sword. Ware ye, boy, lest he pick up the scent. Fetch me word here, beneath this jolly boat." Jack stole away, staggering along the high poop deck until he could cling to the lifeline stretched along the roof of the great cabin. There he slumped down in feigned helplessness, banged against the bulwark as a dripping heap of misery, or kicked aside by the pirates of the watch as they were relieved at the steering tackles. From half-closed eyes he watched Ned Rackham, a vigilant, dominant figure in a tarred jacket and quilted breeches and long sea boots. Now and again he cupped his hands and yelled in the ear of Captain Welsby, whose beard was grey with brine. Jack saw that it was hopeless to get a private word with the skipper on deck. The clamor of the storm was too deafening. The one chance was to intercept him in the cabin when he went below for food and drink. Jack dragged himself to the after-hatchway, which was shoved open a trifle to admit air, and squeezed himself through. Before he tumbled down the steep staircase, he turned to glance at Captain Welsby. Unseen by Ned Rackham, the boy raised his hand in a furtive, beckoning gesture. The pirates had taken the main room of the after-house for their own use, driving the passengers and ship's officers into the small cabins or staterooms. The air was foul below, reeking of the bilges, and the main room was incredibly filthy. The pirates ate from dirty dishes. They had scattered food about, and they kicked off their boots to sleep on the floor like pigs in a sty. Several of them were seated at the long table, bottle and mug in hand, and the gloomy place was poorly lighted by a swinging whale-oil lamp. Jack Cockrell crept unnoticed into a corner and was giddy and almost helpless with nausea. It seemed ages before Captain Welsby's legs appeared in the hatchway, and he came down into the cabin, bringing a shower of spray with him. His kindly face was haggard and sad as he tottered from sheer weariness. Passing through to his own room, a scurvy pirate hurled refuse food at him with a silly laugh, and others insulted him with the foulest epithets. He paid them no heed, and they returned to their own amusements. Jack Cockrell aroused himself to stumble after the skipper, who halted to grasp the lad by the shoulder and shove him headlong into the little room. The door was quickly bolted behind them. A lurch of the vessel flung Jack into the bunk, but he managed to sit up, holding his head in his hands, while he feebly implored, "Did you note me wave my hand, sir, when I came below?"
"Yes, and I followed as soon as I could," answered the master of the Plymouth Adventure. "There was the hint of secrecy in your signal, Jack. What's in the wind?"
"I am the only passenger to win the confidence of one of Blackbeard's crew," explained the lad. "This Joe Hawkridge is true to us, I'll swear it. He is a pressed man, hating his masters. He bids me tell you that Ned Rackham will seize the ship for his own as soon as ever the wind goes down."
"Ah, is he as bold as that?" grunted the skipper, rubbing his nose with an air of rueful surprise. "No honor among thieves, Jack. I thought him loyal to Blackbeard. I have considered attempting something of my own when the weather permits, but this news quickens me. This young imp of Satan that you call Joe, he will side with us in a pinch?"
"Aye, sir, and he knows this Ned Rackham well. There has been talk among the pirates of rising against Blackbeard to follow the fortunes of sailing master Rackham. Here is the ship, as Joe says."
"It has a plausible sound," said Captain Welsby. "My intention was to wait, but I shall have to strike first."
"Can we fight in this storm, sir, even if we manage to release our sailors?"
asked Jack, very dismally. "Not what we can, but what we must do," growled the stubborn British mariner. "The shame of striking my colours rankles like a wound. God helping me, we shall wipe out that stain if we drown in a sinking ship. I talk to you as a man, Master Cockerell, for such you have proven yourself. And who else is there to serve me in this adventure?"
"To set our sailors free, you mean, sir?" eagerly exclaimed Jack. "I took thought of that. There is nobody but me, neither your mates nor the passengers, who can pass among the pirates without suspicion. The knaves have humoured me, hearing the tale of the pirate I knocked on the head and my braggart remark to Blackbeard. They have seen me about the decks with Joe Hawkridge as my boon comrade. 'Tis their fancy that I am likely to enlist."
"Well said, Jack," was the skipper's compliment. "Yes, you might make your way forward without interference, but the forecastle hatches are stoutly guarded. Again, should my brave fellows find exit, they are weaponless, unready. Moreover, they have been crammed in that dark hole, drenched by the sea, cruelly bruised by the tossing of the ship, and weakened for lack of food and air."
"Granted, sir," sighed Jack. "But if some message could be smuggled in to forewarn them of the enterprise, would that brace 'em to the assault?"
"Will ye try it, Jack?" asked the skipper, with a note of appeal in his hearty voice. "I know not where else to turn. You take your life in your hands, but—"
The shipmaster broke off with a grim smile. It was absurd to prate of life and death in such a strait as this. The boy reflected before he said, If I fail, sir, Joe Hawkridge will try to pass a message in to the men. You can depend on it."
"A last resort, Jack. You vouch for him, but I'd trust you far sooner. He has kept sorry company."
"When is the best hour, Captain Welsby?"
"Just before nightfall, when the watches will be changing. I dare not delay it longer than that. In darkness my lads will be unable to find the foe and strike hard and quick, nor can they rush to lay hold of the only weapons in their reach, the pikes in the racks beside the masts. Not a pistol or cutlass amongst them, and they must fight with these wicked dogs of pirates, who think not of killing men."
"Let your lusty sailors once get clear, sir," stoutly declared Jack Cockerell, "and they will play a merry game with those long pikes. Then I am to slip the message written by your hand on a bit of paper?"
"That's it. I will command them to pound against the scuttle 3 raps,
for a signal of response, and you must listen for it. Then it is for them to stand ready, on the chance that you can slip the bar of the hatch or the bolts on the door." "But if they have to come out singly, sir, and the sentries are ready-witted, why, your men may be cut down or pistoled in their tracks." "I am so aware," said Captain Welsby, his honest features glum. "But we cannot change the odds." He found an inkhorn and quill, and laboriously wrote a few lines on a leaf torn from the back of a sea-stained logbook. Jack tucked it carefully away, and thus they parted company, perhaps to meet no more in life. Through the waning afternoon, Jack stowed himself on deck and held long converse with Joe Hawkridge when they met between the keel chocks of the jolly boat. Because he shared not the skipper's feeling of distrust, Jack sought the active aid of his chum of a pirate lad. It was agreed that they should endeavor to reach the forecastle together when the ship's bell tolled the hour of beginning the first night watch. Joe hoped he might decoy or divert the sentries. If not, he had another scheme or two. A gunner's mate of the prize crew had sent him to overhaul the lashings of the battery of 9-pounders, which were ranged along the waist. With several other hands, Joe made all secure, because the guns were apt to get adrift in such weather as this, and plunge to and fro across the deck like maddened beasts. Now Joe Hawkridge had lingered, on pretext of making sure that one forward gun could be fired, if needs be, as a distress signal, should the ship open her seams or strike upon a shoal. He had satisfied himself that the tompion, or wooden plug which sealed the muzzle, was tight, and that no water had leaked through the wrapping of tarred canvas, which protected the touch-hole. Before replacing them, he had made 2 or 3 trips to the deck-house amidships, in which was the carpenter's room. Each time, he tucked inside his shirt as many forged iron spikes, bolts, and what-not as he could safely carry. Unobserved, he shoved this junk down the throat of the 9-pounder and wadded it fast with handfuls of oakum. He worked coolly, without haste, as agile as a monkey, when the ship careened and the sea spurted through the cracks of the gun ports. Well pleased with his task, he said to himself, with that grin which no peril could obliterate, "God alone knows how I can strike fire to a match and keep it alight, but the sky shows signs of easier weather." The fury of the storm had indeed diminished. It might be a respite before the wind hauled into another quarter and renewed its ferocious violence. But the air was no longer thick with the whirling smother of foam and spray, and the straining topmasts had ceased to bend like whips. The ship was gallantly easing herself of the waves which broke aboard, and the rearing billows astern were not threatening to stamp her under. It lacked almost an hour of nightfall when Jack Cockrell crept along the poop and halted to lean against the timbered railing by the mizzen shrouds. All he could think of was that Ned Rackham might seize upon this sudden abatement of the gale to hasten his own wicked conspiracy, and so ruin the plan to restore the Plymouth Adventure to her own lawful company. This menace had occurred to Captain Jonathan Welsby, who stood tense and rigid at the sailing master's elbow, watching him from the tail of his eye. Relief o'erspread the skipper's worn features when he espied Jack Cockrell, who stood as if waiting for orders. A nod, a meaningful glance, and they understood each other. Striving to appear unconcerned, Jack moved toward the forward part of the ship. He was aquiver with excitement, and his breath was quick and small, but the sense of fear had left him. Captain Welsby had called him a man, and by God's sweet grace he would so acquit himself. The pirates were swarming out of the cabin to taste the clean air and limber their cramped muscles. The ship still wallowed as she ran before the wind, and it was breakneck work to clamber about. From the topsail yards fluttered mere ribbons of canvas where the reefed sails had bellied. Ned Rackham shouted for the watch to lay aloft and cut the remnants clear and bend new cloths to keep her from broaching to. Jack Cockrell's heart leaped for joy. At least a dozen of the most active pirates would have to obey this order. This would remove them from the deck for a precious interval of time. He slouched aimlessly nearer the forecastle, stretching his neck to gaze up at the pirates as they footed the ratlines and squirmed over the clumsy tops. Joe Hawkridge joined him, as if by chance, and they wandered to the lee side of the forecastle. There, they were screened from the sight of the sentries. The wooden shutters of the little windows had been spiked fast on the outside, and Jack was at his wits' end to find by what means he might slip the fateful message to the captive seaman. He dared not climb upon the roof and seek for a crack in a hatchway. This would make him too conspicuous. Cautiously, he stole around the massive structure and was all but washed overboard when he gained the windward side, where the water broke in hissing cataracts. So great had been its force during the height of the storm that one of the shutters had been splintered and almost crushed in. Clutching the bit of paper, which was tightly rolled and wrapped in a square of oiled linen, Jack pushed it through a ragged crevice in the shutter. It was gravely doubtful whether the men would discover the message in the gloom of their prison. It might fall to the floor and be trampled unperceived. And yet Jack Cockrell could not make himself believe that deliverance would be thwarted. He said a prayer and waited with his ear against the wall of the forecastle. There he leaned through an agonized eternity as the slow moments passed. It was like the ordeal of a condemned man who hopes that a blessed reprieve may save him, in the last hour, from the black cap and the noose. Up aloft, the pirate seamen were slashing the torn canvas with their dirks and casting loose the gaskets. Presently they began to come down to the deck, one by one. Some whispered word must have passed amongst them, because they drifted aft as by a common impulse, although it was not yet the hour to change the watch. Their gunner's mate, a gigantic mulatto with a broken nose, went to the poop when Ned Rackham crooked his finger, and these two stood aside, beyond earshot of Captain Welsby, while they conferred with heads together. "They will strike first," Jack whispered to himself. The misty daylight had not darkened. The decks were not yet dusky with the shadows which Jack had hoped might enable him to approach the forecastle door in his brave endeavor to unbar it. The plans were all awry. Tears filled his eyes. And then there came to his ear a muffled knock against the other side of the forecastle planking. Once, twice, thrice. The signal was unmistakable. A little interval, and it was repeated. Softly the trembling lad tiptoed to the corner of the forecastle house and peered around to look for the sentries. Two of them had moved a few yards away to join a group which gazed aft, as if expecting a summons from Ned Rackham on the poop. The third sentry leaned against the forecastle door, a cutlass at his belt. He was a long, bony man, with a face as yellow as parchment from the Spanish fever, and it was plain to read that there was no great strength in him. Faithful Joe Hawkridge sat astride the breech of a 9-pounder, at which he had been so busily engaged earlier in the afternoon. He appeared to be an idler who merely looked on, but he was watching every motion, and that hard, canny face of his had, for once, forgot to grin. Releasing a 3-foot handspike from its lashing beside the gun carriage, he awaited the next roll of the deck and deftly kicked this handy weapon. It slid toward the forecastle, and Jack Cockrell stopped it with his foot. There was no time for hesitation. Snatching up the iron-shod handspike, Jack rushed straight at the forecastle door. Just then the ship lurched far down, and he was shot headlong, like falling off the roof of a house. He had the momentum of a battering ram. The sentry yelled and drew his cutlass with a swiftness amazing in a sick man. His footing was unsteady, or Jack would have spitted himself on the point of the blade. As he went crashing full tilt into the man, the impact was terrific. They went to the deck together, and the handspike spun out of Jack's grasp. There was no need to swing it on this luckless pirate, for his bald head smote a plank with a thump, which must have cracked it like an egg. Not even pausing to dart after the cutlass, which had clattered from the lifeless fingers, Jack spun on his heel and wrenched at the heavy bar across the forecastle door and felt it slide from the fastenings. He tugged it clear and swung himself up to the roof to draw the bolts which secured the hatch. Rusted in their sockets, they resisted him, but he spied a pulley block within reach and used it as a hammer. All this was a matter of seconds only. The pirates, grouped amidships, had been waiting for Ned Rackham's word from aft, and they were muddled by this sudden shift of action. The other sentries stared in foolish astonishment. The brief delay was enough to let Jack Cockrell free the hatch. While he toiled furiously, several pistols and a musket were snapped at him, but the flint sparked on damp powder in the pans, and only one ball whistled by his head. Out of the forecastle hatchway and through the door, the enraged sailors of the Plymouth Adventure came rocketing like an explosion. They stumbled over each other, emerging head or feet first, blinking like owls in the daylight, but with vision good enough to serve their purpose. Their goal was the nearest stand of boarding pikes at the foot of the mainmast. But as they came surging on deck, they were not empty-handed. In the forecastle was a bricked oven for warmth in winter and for cooking kettles of soup. This they had torn to pieces, and every man sallied forth with a square, flat brick in each hand and more inside his shirt. Those who were first to gain the deck pelted the nearest pirates with these ugly missiles. The air was full of hurtling bricks, and the earliest casualty was a stout buccaneer who stopped one with his stomach. Driven back in yelling confusion, the pirates found their firearms almost useless, so drenched had the whole ship been by the battering seas. But they were accustomed to fighting it out with the cold steel, and they were by no means a panicky mob. The fusillade of bricks held them long enough for the merchant sailors to escape from the forecastle, and this was an advantage more precious than Captain Welsby had hoped for. What the pirates required was a leader to rally them for attack. Quicker than it takes to tell it, Ned Rackham had raced along the poop and leaped to the waist at peril of breaking his neck. Agile, quick-witted, he bounded into the thick of it, cutlass in hand, while he shouted, "At 'em, lads, and give the dogs no quarter!" With hoarse outcry, his gallows birds mustered compactly, while those who had been in the cabin came scampering to join them. Curiously enough, Captain Jonathan Welsby had been forgotten. He was left alone to handle the ship, while the pirate helmsman stood by the great tiller. To forsake it meant to let the vessel run wild and perhaps turn turtle in the swollen seas. And so the doughty skipper was, for the time, a looker-on. And now, with Ned Rackham in the van, it seemed that the British sailors were in a parlous plight, and that their sortie must fail. Craftily, the pirates maneuvered to drive them back into the forecastle, and there to butcher them like sheep. Chapter 5. Releasing a Fearful Weapon. Jack Cockerell sprawled flat upon the forecastle roof and knew not what to do. He could lay hands on nothing to serve as a weapon, and he bade fair to be trapped like the sailors whose cause he had joined. With a feeling of despair, he let his gaze rove to the scrawny figure of Joe Hawkridge, who still bestrode the 9-pounder and took no part in the fray. But Joe had no comfort for him, as a gesture conveyed. It had been Joe's wild scheme to obtain the help of Jack and Captain Welsby, at the least, and so cast loose the gun and slew it around to rake the deck and mow the pirates down. But the men were lacking for this heavy task, and the sailors of the Plymouth Adventure were too intent on fighting against fearful odds to pay heed to Joe Hawkridge's appeals. He had even skulked into the galley and was ready with a little iron pot filled with live coals, which was hidden under a bit of tarpaulin. Ned Rackham was a young man and powerful, with a long reach and a skilled blade. He fairly hewed his way into the ruck of the dauntless sailors who had more bricks to hurl. Several pirates were disabled, with broken arms or bloody crowns, but the others crowded forward, grunting as they slashed and stabbed, and well aware that Ned Rackham would cut the laggards down should he detect them. At the moment where there seemed no chance of salvation for the crew of the Plymouth Adventure, Joe Hawkridge leaped from the gun and beckoned Jack. The grin was restored to the homely freckled visage, and the saltwater gamin danced in jubilant excitement. Down from the forecastle roof tumbled Jack Cockerell and went sliding across the deck, heels over head, to fetch up in the scupper. Joe hauled him by the leg, close to the wooden carriage of the gun, and swiftly told him what was to be done. Obediently, Jack began to loose the knots which secured the rope tackles, but it was a slow task. The wet had made the hemp as hard as iron, and he lacked a marlinspike. Joe dodged around the gun, saw the difficulty, and sawed through one rope after another, all but the last strand or two. Then the lads tailed onto the breeching hawsers, which held the carriage from sliding on its iron rollers, and eased the strain as well as they could. The ponderous mass was almost free to plunge across the deck. Joe sweated and braced his feet against a ring-bolt, while Jack Cockerell found a cleat. Ned Rackham's men were moving forward, cut and thrust, while the sailors grappled with them bare-handed and battled grimly like mastiffs. "The next time she rolls," panted Joe Hawkridge, as the hawser ripped the skin from his palms. "Aye, make ready to cut," muttered Jack. The ship heaved herself high and then listed far down to starboard. Joe slashed at the last strands of the tackles and yelled to Jack to let go the hawser. Instead of discharging the 9-pounder, they were employing the piece itself and the carriage of oak and iron as a terrible missile. The moment of launching it was shrewdly chosen. The pirates, still in compact formation as led by Ned Rackham, were directly abreast of this forward gun of the main deck battery. The deck inclined at a steep and giddy pitch. With a grinding roar, the gun rolled from its station. It gathered impetus and lunged across the ship as an instrument of fell destruction. It was more to be feared than an assault of armed men. The warning rumble of the iron wheels as they furrowed the planking was heard by the pirates. They turned from their game of butchery and stood frozen in their tracks for a frightened instant. Then they tried to flee in all directions. Their tarry pigtails fairly stood on end. Well they knew what it meant to have a gun break adrift in a heavy sea. 2 or 3 who had been badly hurt were unable to move fast enough. The gun crunched over them and then seemed to pursue a limping pirate, veering to overtake him as he fled. He was tossed against the bulwark like a bundle of bloody rags. The gun crashed into the stout timbers of the ship's side, and they splintered like matchwood. It rebounded as the deck sloped sharply in the next wallowing roll, and now this frenzied monster of wood and iron seemed fairly to run amok. It was inspired with a sinister intelligence, resolved to wreak all the damage possible. The pinnace, the water barrels, the coamings of the cargo hatches were smashed to fragments as the gun turned this way and that and went plunging in search of victims. Left to themselves, the seamen of the Plymouth Adventure would have risked their lives to cast ropes about the gun and moor it fast. But now they were quick to see that the tide had been turned in their favor. The pirates were demoralized. Some were in the rigging, others atop the bulwarks, and only the readiest and boldest, with Ned Rackham in the lead, had an eye to the task in hand, which was to regain possession of the ship. And now the boatswain of the Plymouth Adventure, a rosy giant of a man from South Devon, shouted to his comrades to follow him. They delayed until the runaway cannon crashed into another gun, and then they broke like sprinters from the mark and sped straight for the mainmast, seeking the rack of boarding pikes. They ran nimbly, as men used to swaying decks, and compassed the distance in a few strides. Ned Rackham perceived their purpose and tried to intercept, but his few staunch followers moved warily, expecting to see that insensate monster of a gun bear down upon them. The swiftest of the merchant sailors laid hands on the pikes and whirled to cover their shipmates, until all hands could be armed. Then the gun came roaring down at them, but they ducked behind the mast or stepped watchfully aside. Men condemned to death are not apt to lose their wits in the face of one more peril. These pikes were ashen shafts with long steel points, and the merchant seamen had been trained to use them. And the brawn of these lads made the pike a match for a pirate's cutlass. Ned Rackham bounded forward to swing at the broad, deep-chested boatswain. A wondrous pair of antagonists they were, in the prime of their youth and vigor. The pirate's cutlass bit clean through the pike shaft as the boatswain parried the blow, but the apple-cheeked Devonshire man closed in and wrapped his arms around his foe. They went to the deck, clutching for each other's throats, and the fight trampled over them. Meanwhile, Joe Hawkridge and Jack Cockrell, unwilling to twiddle their thumbs, had rushed aft as fast as their legs could carry them. It was a mutual impulse to release such of the men passengers as might have a stomach for fighting, and also the ship's officers. Into the doorway which led from the waist, the 2 lads dived and scurried through the main cabin, now clear of pirates. Locked doors they smashed with a broadaxe found in the small-arms chest, and so entered all the rooms. The women passengers were almost dead with suffering, what with the turbulence of the storm and the wild riot on deck. The lads pitied them but had no time to console. Several of the men, merchants and planters of some physical hardihood, begged for weapons, and Joe Hawkridge bade them help themselves from the spare arms which the pirates had left in the great cabin. In another little room the boys found the mates, steward, surgeon, and gunner of the Plymouth Adventure, and you may be sure that they came boiling out with a raging thirst for strife. "Harkee, Jack," said Joe before they climbed to the poop deck, "if the pirates are driven aft as I expect,
They will take a last stand in this cabin-house, which is like a fort. These fenceless women must be hidden safe from harm. Do you coax them into the lazarette."
This was a room on the deck below, in the very stern of the ship, where were kept the extra sails and coils of rope and various stores. It was the surest shelter against harm in such stress as this. Alas, Jack's persuasions were vain. The frantic women were in no humor to listen, and so the lads bundled them through the hatch as gently as possible, and for company gave them such male passengers as lacked strength or courage to join the battle. While they were thus engaged, 2 pirates came flying down the ladder from the poop deck into the main cabin. They revolved like windmills in a jumble of arms and legs. Close behind them, in a manner more orderly, came Captain Jonathan Welsby, who had tossed the one and tremendously booted the other. They were the helmsman, whom he had replaced with his own officers at the steering tackles, while his first mate had been left in charge of handling the ship. The skipper was now free to follow his own desires, and he fell upon those 2 stunned pirates in the cabin and trussed them tight with bits of rope. Then he reloaded with dry powder all the pistols he could find and made a walking arsenal of himself. The 2 lads, who now joined him, needed no word of command. At his heels they made for the main deck, and the shout which arose from those British sailors, so sorely beset, was mightily heartening. Blazing away with his pistols, the skipper cleared a path for himself, the pirates being taken aback when they were attacked in the rear. And they were leaderless, for Ned Rackham had been dragged aside with the marks of the boatswain's fingers on his throat and a sheath knife buried in his side. He was alive, but nobody paid heed to his groans. With the skipper in the thick of it, there was no danger of being penned in the forecastle again. The pirates were crowded aft, step by step, before the play of those wicked boarding pikes. It would be hard to match a sea fight like this, amid the spray and the washing seas, on a deck that tipsily danced and staggered, with a truant gun smashing a good ship to bits, and the wounded screaming as they saw this horror thundering at them. Captain Welsby's men were at pains to drag their helpless comrades to safety, but the pirates were too callous and too hard-pressed to care for aught save their own worthless skins. They fought like wolves, but they lacked the gristle and endurance of the stalwart sailors. Wheezing for breath, they ceased to curse and reeled back in silence while the sailors huzzaed and seemed to wax the lustier. As was bound to happen, the stubborn retreat broke into a rout. It was every man for himself, and the devil take the hindmost. The pirates fled for the after cabin house, there to take cover behind the timbered walls and use the small portholes for musketry fire. Thus they could find respite, and it would be immensely difficult to dislodge them. The first mate of the Plymouth Adventure and his own 2 helmsmen saw what was taking place, and they were in no mind to be cut off at the stern of the ship. They footed it along the poop and the cabin roof, as the pirates were scampering inside, and so gained the waist and were with their comrades. The tiller deserted, the vessel careened into the trough of the sea with a portentous creaking of spars and rending of canvas. The mainmast had been dealt more than one splintering blow by the fugitive gun. This sudden strain, of a ship broached to and hurled almost on her beam ends, was too much for the damaged mast. It broke short off, a few feet above the deck, and the ragged butt ripped the planks asunder as it was dragged overside by the weight of the towering fabric of yards and canvas. One merciful circumstance befell, for the tangle of shrouds and sheets and halyards ensnared the ramping monster of a cannon and overturned it. Caught in this manner, the gun was dragged to the broken bulwark, and there it was held with the battered carriage in air. The mainmast was floating alongside the ship, which it belabored with thumps that jarred the hull. It was likely to stave in the skin of the vessel, and Captain Welsby shouted to his men to hack at the trailing cordage and send the mast clear before it did a fatal injury. A dozen men risked drowning at this task, while the others guarded the after cabin, lest the pirates attempt to sally. These besieged rogues were given an interval in which to muster their force, organize a defense, and break into the magazine for muskets and powder and ball. Now Captain Welsby was no dullard, and he purposed to make short work of these vile pirates. Otherwise his crippled ship might not survive the wind and weather. He conferred with his gunner, who had bethought himself, by force of habit, to fetch from aft his powder horn and several yards of match, or twisted tow, which were wrapped around his body, beneath the tarred jerkin.
"It grieves me sore to wreck yonder goodly cabin-house," said the skipper in his beard, but by Judas we'll blow 'em out of it. Haul and belay your pieces, Master Gunner, and let 'em have a salvo of round shot."
Reckless of the musket balls which began to fly among them, the sailors jumped for their stations and the guns. First, they set aright that capsized 9-pounder which had wreaked so much mischief, and found that it could be discharged, despite the broken carriage. Joe Hawkridge and Jack Cockrell blithely aided to swing and secure it with emergency tackles, and Joe exclaimed with a chuckle, "This dose is enough to surprise Blackbeard himself. 'Tis an ironmonger's shop I rammed down its throat." The gun was laid on the largest cabin porthole, just as it framed the ugly face of a pirate with a musket, while another peered over his shoulder. Joe shook the powder horn from the touch-hole, and the gunner was ready with the match, which he had lighted with his own flint and steel. Boom! And the gun recoiled in a veil of smoke. Through the cabin porthole flew a deadly shower of spikes and bolts, while the framework around it was shattered to bits. It was a most unhealthy place for pirates. They forsook it instantly, and the musketry fire slackened elsewhere. It was to be inferred that there was painful consternation in the cabin. With boisterous mirth, the sailors deftly turned other guns to bear, and were careful not to let them get adrift. The muzzles had been well stopped against wetting by the sea, and with a little dry powder for the priming, most of them could be served. They could not be reloaded for dearth of ammunition, but Captain Welsby felt confident that one round would suffice. Methodically, the gun crews aimed and fired one gun after another, watching the chance between the seas that broke aboard. The solid round shot at short range ripped through the cabin walls and bulkheads and buried themselves in the frames and timbers of the ship's stern. A good gunner was never so happy as when he saw the white splinters fly in showers, and these zealous sailormen forgot they were knocking their own ship to pieces. They were on the target, and this was good enough. The beleaguered pirates made no more pretense of firing muskets or defying the crew to dig them out. Their fort was an untenable position. At this sport of playing bowls with round shot, they were bound to lose. Captain Welsby sighted the last gun himself. It was a bronze culverin of large bore, taken as a trophy from the stranded wreck of a Spanish galleon. With a tremendous blast, this formidable cannon spat out a double-shotted load, and the supports of the cabin roof were torn asunder. The tottering beams collapsed. Half the structure fell in. It was the signal for the sailors of the Plymouth Adventure to charge aft and finish the business. They found pirates crawling from under the wreckage. It was like a demolished ant heap. In the smaller cabins and other rooms far aft, which were more or less intact, some of the rascals showed fight, but they were remorselessly prodded out with pikes, and those unwounded were hustled forward to be thrown into the forecastle. It was difficult to restrain the seamen from dealing them the death they deserved, but Captain Welsby was no sea-butcher, and he hoped to turn them over to the colonial authorities to be hanged with due ceremony. The badly hurt were laid in the forecastle bunks, where the ship's surgeon washed and bandaged them after he had cared for the injured men of his own crew. Ned Rackham was still alive, conscious and defiant, surviving a wound which would have been mortal in most cases. Whether he lived or died was a matter of small concern to Captain Welsby, but he ordered the surgeon to nurse him with special care. The dead pirates were flung overboard, but the bodies of 7 brave British seamen were wrapped in sailcloth to be committed to the deep on the morrow, with a round shot at their feet and a prayer to speed their souls. There were men enough to work the ship, but she was in a situation indescribably forlorn. It was possible to patch and shore the cabin house and make a refuge, even to find place for the wretched women who were lifted unharmed out of the lazarette. But the stout ship, her mainmast gone by the board, the deck ravaged by that infernal catapult of an errant gun, the hull pounded by the floating wreckage of spars, would achieve a miracle should she see port again. The combat with the pirates and their overthrow had been waged in the last hour before the grey night closed over a somber sea. God's mercy had caused the wind to fall and the waves to diminish in size, else the ship would have gone to the bottom ere dawn. Much water had washed down into the hold through the broken cargo hatch and the gaps where the runaway gun had torn other fittings away. The carpenter sounded the well and solemnly stared at the wetted rod by the flicker of his horn lantern. The ship was settling. It was his doleful surmise that she leaked where the pounding spars overside had started the butts. It was man the pumps to keep the old hooker afloat, and Captain Welsby ordered his weary men to sway at the brakes, watch and watch. Joe Hawkridge and Jack Cockrell, more fit for duty than the others, put their backs into it right heartily, while the sailors droned to the cadence of the pump a sentimental ditty, which ran on for any number of verses, and began in this wise.
As lately I travelled toward Gravesend, I heard a fair damsel a seaman commend, and as in a tilt-boat we passed along, in praise of brave seamen she sung this new song. Come tradesman or merchant, whoever he be, there's none but a seaman shall marry with me.
Thus they laboured all the night through, men near dead with fatigue, whose hard fate it was to contend now with pirates and again with the hostile ocean. The skipper managed to stay the foremast and to bend steering sails so that the ship was brought into the wind, where her motion was easier. The sky cleared before daybreak, and the rosy horizon proclaimed a fair sunrise. How far and in what direction the Plymouth Adventure had been blown by the storm was largely guesswork. By means of dead reckoning and the compass and cross-staff, Captain Welsby hoped to work out a position, but meanwhile he scanned the sea with a sense of brooding anxiety. Instead of praying for plenty of sea room, he now hoped with all his heart that the vessel had been set in toward the coast. She was sinking under his feet and would not live through the day. It was useless to toil at the pumps or to strive at mending the shattered upperworks. The men turned to the task of quitting the ship and of saving the souls on board. It was a pitiful extremity, and yet they displayed a dogged, unshaken fidelity. Only one boat had escaped destruction. The pinnace had been staved in by the thunderbolt of a gun, and the yawl, stowed upon the cabin roof, was wrecked by round shot. The small jolly boat would hold the women passengers and the wounded sailors, with the hands required to tend oars and sail. Nothing remained but to try to knock together one or more rafts. Captain Welsby discussed it with his officers, and it was agreed that the able-bodied pirates should be left to build a raft for themselves, taking their own wounded with them. This was more mercy than they had any right to expect. The strapping young Devonshire boatswain, with his head tied up, was for leaving the blackguards to drown in the forecastle, but the shipmaster was too humane a man for that. It was drawing toward noon when the first mate descried land to the westward, a bit of low coast, almost level with the sea. In the light air, the sluggish ship moved ever so slowly, with canvas spread on the fore and mizzen masts. Spirits revived, and life tasted passing sweet. To drift in the open sea upon wave-washed rafts was an expedient which all mariners shuddered to contemplate. It was with feelings far different that they now assembled spars and planks and lashed and spiked them together on the chance of needing rafts to ferry them ashore from a stranded ship. Well into the bright afternoon, the Plymouth Adventure was wafted nearer and nearer the sandy coast. Within a half-mile of it, a line of breakers frothed and tumbled on a shoal, beyond which the water deepened again. The ship could not be steered to avoid this barrier. Her main deck was almost level with the sea, which lapped her gently and sobbed through the broken bulwarks. With a slight shock, she struck the shoal and rested there just before she was ready to founder. With disciplined haste, the jolly boat was launched and filled with its human freightage. The boatswain went in charge and 4 seamen tugged at the sweeps. There were trees and clumps of bushes among the hillocks of sand, and a tiny bight for a landing place. The bulwark was then chopped away so that the largest raft could be shoved into the water by means of tackles, rollers, and handspikes. It floated buoyantly and supported as many as 15 men, who did not mind in the least getting their feet wet. Upon a raised platform in the center of the raft were fastened barrels of beef and bread and casks of fresh water. The jolly boat could hope to make other trips between the ship and the shore, but the prudent skipper took no chances with the weather. A sudden gale might pluck the Plymouth Adventure from the shoal or tear her to fragments where she lay. Therefore most of the men, including passengers, were embarked on the raft. Captain Welsby remained aboard with a few of his sailors and our 2 lads, Joe and Jack, who had not attempted to thrust themselves upon the crowded raft. The pirates were making a commotion in the forecastle, yammering to be freed, but the skipper had no intention of loosing them until all his people had safely abandoned ship. The jolly boat made a landing without mishap and returned to the wreck as the sun went down. More stores were dumped into it, sacks of potatoes and onions, which had been overlooked, bedding for the women, powder and ball for the muskets, and other things which it was necessary to keep dry. Captain Welsby got rid of the rest of his men on this trip, excepting the gunner and carpenter, and these lingered with him as a kind of bodyguard, pending the ticklish business of releasing the imprisoned pirates and forsaking them to their own devices. The jolly boat was laden to the gunwales, and Jack Cockerell held back, saying to Joe Hawkridge, "Why trouble the captain to set us ashore? Let us make a raft of our own. The breeze holds fair to the beach, and it will be a lark." "It suits me well," grinned Joe. "If we wait to go off with the master, and those sinful pirates see me aboard, I'll need wings to escape 'em. They saw me serve the gun that was filled with spikes to the muzzle. Aye, Jack, I will feel happier to be elsewhere when Captain Welsby unbars the forecastle and holds 'em back with his pistols till he can cast off in the jolly boat." "Yes, the sight of you is apt to put them in a vile temper," laughingly agreed Jack. "And 'tis awkward for the master to bother with us. Now, about a little raft. 2 short spars are enough, there they lie, and the cabin hatch will do for a deck, spikes for thole pins, and oars from the pinnace. Unlace the bonnet of the jib for a sail. You are a proper sailorman, Joe. A voyage by starlight to an unknown coast. 'Tis highly romantic." They set to work without delay. Captain Welsby had occupations of his own, and no more than glanced at them in passing. Jack insisted on carrying a water breaker and rations, he being hungry and too busy to pause for supper. They would make a picnic cruise of the adventure. Handily, Joe reeved a purchase, and they hauled away until their raft slid off the sloping deck to leeward. With a gay hurrah to Captain Welsby, they padded around the stern of the ship and through the ruffle of surf that marked the shoal. In the soft twilight, they trimmed the sail and swung at the clumsy oars, while a fire, blazing on the beach, was a beacon to guide their course. After a time, they rested and wiped the sweat from their faces. The progress of the raft was like that of a lazy snail. In the luminous darkness, they pulled with all their strength. The wind had died to a calm. The sail hung idle from its yard. They heard, faint and afar, the deep voices of the sailors in the jolly boat as they returned to take the skipper and his 2 companions from the ship on which a light burned. The lads shouted, but there came no answering hail from the unseen boat. They were perplexed to understand how their courses could be so far apart. Presently, the night breeze drew off the land, bringing with it the scent of green things growing. Joe Hawkridge stared at the fire on the beach, and then turned to look at the spark of light on the ship. The raft had drifted considerably to the southward. Anxiously, Joe said to his shipmate, "The flood of the tide must be settling us down the coast in some crazy current or other. Mayhap it runs strong through this race betwixt the shoal and the beach, with a slant that's bad for us." "I noted it," glumly agreed Jack. "The jolly boat passed too far away to please me, and this landward breeze is driving us to sea." "No sense in breaking our backs at these oars," grumbled Joe. "We go ahead like a crab, with a sternboard. Think ye we can swing the raft to fetch the ship? After Captain Welsby turns the pirates loose and quits her?" scoffed Jack. "I am a plaguey fool," cheerfully admitted Joe Hawkridge. "'Twould be out of the frying pan into the fire, with a vengeance." "And no way to signal our friends," sadly exclaimed Jack. "We forgot flint and steel. It looks much like another voyage." "Straight for the open sea, my bully boy," agreed Joe. "And I'd as soon chance it on a hen coop." This is B.J. Harrison. I hope you've enjoyed this unabridged production of Blackbeard Buccaneer Part 2 of 8 by Ralph D. Paine. If you've enjoyed this book, you might also enjoy The Master of Ballantrae by Robert Louis Stevenson, which also features Blackbeard. And you can listen to all the pirate tales you want with your Audiobook Library Card. Click on over to audiobooklibrarycard.com now and click the appropriate button. Use the coupon code ClassicTales2 and save $3 on your first month. Thank you for joining me today and allowing classic literature to awaken your better self. Please join me next time, and we'll rediscover the greatest stories ever put to paper.